I'm joined today by Dr. Ray Perryman, and you're going to learn a little bit more about him before we get into some of the topics that we want to talk about and what you really came to listen to. But I always think before you listen to somebody, it's really good to have a context of where that person's coming from and the perspective that person has and why. And so Ray, let me thank you for carving out time to be with us today. I know you mentioned that you were giving counsel to a congressional committee this morning, and now you're talking and counseling with our alums. So you're a busy man, and we appreciate you carving out time from your busy schedule. So it's great to see you again. Let me ask you just to provide some brief background. Who is Ray Perryman? Where did you grow up? Let's just start there before we get into some of the topics today.
Yeah, when you told me you might ask me that question, I asked my wife and my kids, who is Ray Perryman, and I can't repeat any of the answers.
Who is that?
We have to start from there. And I've been so fortunate, so blessed. My career has been so diverse. I've been able to get involved in a whole lot of things, and I can't say it was because of a lot of planning. It was things kind of happened in a very fortuitous way for me, and I feel very blessed about that. But I guess probably the short way to describe me, and then I'll talk about where I grew up, but the short way to describe me is I'm a father of 5, a grandfather of 4 with one on the way. And as I say, I've been very blessed to get to be involved in major events and major happenings all over the world for a long time now. And I just feel very fortunate to have had the experience that I've had. Didn't start out that way. Grew up in the small town over in East Texas, Lindale. Best known these days as the home of Miranda Lambert. And but at the time I was there, it was a much smaller town even than it is now. I think we had about 1,200 people in the town at the time. And probably a fairly typical small town background. I was the first person in my family to finish high school, the first one to go to college. So it was very different than the world I came to inhabit later. But was a very pleasant background. One story they told a few years ago, they started a Distinguished Alumni Award from the school over there, and they were kind enough to give it to me. And I went over and spent a couple of days and saw some old friends and spent some time over there. And my wife asked me what it was like growing up in a town that small. And I said it was great. I really loved it. And she said, "Well, any challenges?" And I said, "Not really."
I tell you, you received a Baylor degree. Why Baylor? Given that you're the first one out of the family to go to college, how did Baylor come up?
Probably a couple of things, several things. I mean, I was a small town Texas kid, probably not like some of you who are out there, and I was a small town Texas Baptist kid. Okay. And so Baylor was kind of the ultimate place that you wanted to go from that perspective. Several of my friends who were a year older than me had gone to Baylor and liked it a lot. And then I had enough scholarships and stuff I could afford it. So I think that I can't say it was a huge systematic choice. I didn't go down a list and rank people and put pros and cons or anything like that. But it just kind of fell into place, and I'm very pleased that it did. I had a great experience at Baylor.
I'll tell you, our relationship goes back, I think we first crossed paths during the academic year of 1972-73. When I say that, I realize that there are several people on this webcast who are listening that weren't born at that point in time.
Yeah, I know, it's disgusting, isn't it?
So there's a very diverse group attending today, but you happen to be, I actually taught for a year as a lecturer as I had finished my master's in economics and was teaching for a year before I went over to get my PhD. And you happened to be in one of my first classes that I taught. And I guess I'm here to say and confess to the public here that I'm just glad to know that I didn't do any damage to your career. I sometimes refer to that as the gap in my education, but it's quite okay. If I can tell one funny story, the year before that, when I was a freshman, I went to Baylor as a math major, and honestly, I was a smart kid that was good with numbers and figured I could make a living somehow if I got a math degree. Again, there wasn't a lot of thought went into that.
And at that time, the BS in math required you take at least 15 hours of one other field, like chemistry, physics, and a bunch of stuff. And economics was on the list. And I wasn't really a hard science fan at the time. I became one later and kind of got obsessed with some of it. But now I'm not. Or then I wasn't. And so I looked, and I'd placed out of most of the initial stuff. So I had to take some really hard courses. So the two that were left were economics and psychology. And so I flipped a coin and took my first economics class. And it was someone that many of you in this audience will know, and that was, and Terry certainly knows well. He was our former chairman when we shared the faculty positions together, Jim Truitt. And when Jim, basically, I took my first economics class from Jim, Principles of Economics, first semester I was at school. And it just worked out that that was the first test I had in college, was the economics test. So I'd never had a test. And again, I was from a small town. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't come from an educated family. And so I didn't know if I was keeping up or doing, I didn't know how things were going. And this was a large class, and we took the test, and a couple of days later, Jim hands back the test. And, but before he hands it back, he says, Dr. Perryman, or he said, Mr. Perryman, I would like to see you in my office. I didn't think that was good news at the time. You know? And I thought, well, you're so bad that he's just telling you to go home or something. And I walked in his office, and I'm very nervous. And he asked me to sit down. As you know, Jim can be very formal and officious at times, and many of you know. And he said, well, it should take you 4 years to get a degree, 4 years to get a PhD. By then, I think my starting salaries will be X. What do you think? And so he basically offered me a job after the first economics test. That made me think maybe I ought to think about this field, and ended up minoring in it and going and getting a PhD in it. So that was probably my most significant first year experience at Baylor.
Well, and we'll get to the questions now that I'd like to pose to you, but you not only were a student of mine back in that time period, but then I think we joined the faculty roughly at the same time. I went up to Indiana.
We came back at the same time.
I think we came back at the same time, and really this kind of lays.
You became the greatest dean in history, and I left. So what can you say?
We go. This kind of lays the groundwork for what we're going to be talking about today. But I remember just as you started, I think we both started in 77 or so, 77, 78, and you immediately started developing from scratch your econometric model.
Right.
Back in the department. So 40 years later, here we are, and you're using that model, or the framework, that model, to do everything that you're doing. So anyway, congratulations on a great career. Let me turn to some of the topics that we'd like to pose today to get your thought on and your perspective. And let's just start out kind of with the big kind of global picture that's on everyone's mind. And what are your thoughts in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and through the lens and viewpoint of an economist?
Well, the first thing I'd say about it is that it is atypical. Because normally we've had some outside forces like an oil embargo, and we've had and obviously 9/11, things like that impacted the economy in pretty big ways. But if you go back, you have to go back a long way to find a recession that wasn't caused by a structural problem in the economy. Obviously, the mortgage bubble was one. The dot-com bubble was one. The savings and loan crisis was one. And you really have to go back to the oil mess in the 70s to find anything that wasn't purely something we sort of brought on ourselves by creating some type of speculative bubble. We came into this one in the middle of the longest recovery in the history of the country, the longest expansion, 10 plus years. And, it wasn't perfect, it never is, but basically the economy was doing okay. And so what that tells us is we didn't have an economic problem coming into this. It was caused by a health crisis. A massive health crisis. And that's very atypical. But what it also tells us, and I think it's so important, I think some folks along the way who have lost sight of this, and that is, if we want to ultimately solve the economic problem, we have to solve the health problem, because that is the ultimate thing. The other thing we have to do that kind of colors everything in place and things we'll be talking about later is we have to keep that structure together. It was fine when we started, but when you have 5 months of a lot of people not having a job, small businesses not having income, being forced to close, or operate at a very low level, major industries like the airlines just being decimated. If you're not careful, that structure can go away in the middle of that. But if we can keep that structure together during the pandemic, we can come back from it fairly quickly. And I think we've already seen some numbers that kind of show us a little bit of that. as we work our way through this. But you know, my lens is always that I always try to look for historical examples, and the one everybody talks about, you know, that's somewhat similar is the Spanish flu, and that was over a century ago. And it's not really a very good one. There's a few lessons from it, but it's not really a very good historical marker because that was 1918. We were not a world power in 1918. The Federal Reserve was 5 years old. It didn't have any of the powers that it has now. We didn't learn really how to do economic policy until the 1930s. We pretty much didn't do much economic policy prior to the 1930s. And so consequently, it's an entirely different situation, even though the pandemic was worse. I mean, 60 million cases and 30 million cases and 600,000 deaths on a population a third the size we are now. So even though the pandemic itself was much worse, there aren't a lot of parallels there. They're just not. And so basically, we're kind of, you know, building the airplane and flying at the same time right now.
Okay, well, thanks. You know, things have gotten so big now. Everything now is in trillions of dollars. It used to be in billions of dollars.
Right.
Now it's the T. You know, I'd like, from an economic standpoint and economic consultant standpoint, what's your view on the federal government's economic stimulus package that is put together? Matter of fact, it's getting ready to come out with the second stimulus package. What's the impact as you see it for the short term, but maybe from my perspective, more from the long term as well? Can we really handle that as a country?
Sure. Yeah. Well, let's. That's a very good way to put that. Any of you who've heard me speak in the last 10 years, 15 years, probably have heard this at some point in time because I tend to drift off into it, whatever else I'm supposed to talk about, is the federal government for the last 10 or 15 years has been totally irresponsible in the way it spent money. And that is, I mean, we run deficits all the time. We never try to pay for anything. A friend of mine who was a former statewide public office holder who is one of the best politicians I ever met once said he told me about 10 or 15 years ago that the difference between Republicans and Democrats was they'd both spend everything you'd give them and then some, but the Republicans would feel bad about it. In the last 4 or 5 years, the Republicans haven't even felt bad about it. I mean, you look at the tax cut we put in with no offsetting revenue. You look at we turned right around the next week and passed a budget that basically had everything they wanted in it and added $300 billion more to the deficit a couple of years ago. I mean, all of this is taking place. So we have not shown any fiscal discipline for a long time. And when you have a 10-year recovery, that's the time to show some fiscal discipline, because you have the luxury of doing that without harming individuals. Today, so the bottom line is I come from this perspective of I think deficits have been out of control for a long time. Debt's been out of control for a long time. Having said that, the short-term situation is we don't have any choice but to do some stimulus. And it comes back to what I said earlier. We have to keep the structure together. And you can't have all of a sudden people, you know, that are hardworking folks who've had jobs and supported their families for years, all of a sudden have no income for 5 or 6 months and expect them to get by. Or businesses, small businesses that have operated family businesses for generations. So all of a sudden, very few businesses can withstand, you know, five months of expenses and no income. And so you get into these situations. So I think we have to do it. Now, the way they've done it, parts of it have worked well, parts of it haven't. It's not the most efficient thing in the world. In all fairness, they've never had to deal with anything like this before. But there are some inefficiencies that have happened. They sent money to dead people, and the PPP had a kind of a rocky rollout and had some issues. But the idea of getting money into the system right now is very important short term. Long term, it's going to inflate the deficits, and we're going to have to deal with it. And this is one of those situations that's very frustrating to me because, as you know, Terry, a lot of my research I've done over the years has been about how you optimize things. Yeah. And this is one of those situations where there's not a whole lot of optimization that takes place. You can't even say do no harm. All you can say is do the least harm possible. And so we're clearly creating some problems down the road, but I think we don't have a choice. Whether you like John Maynard Keynes or not, and he had some parts of the economics were good, some were not. The way people characterized it was not what it was. In fact, his last article was entitled "I'm Not a Keynesian." But anyway, having said that, he said something very wise in the 1930s. People kept telling him, you know, ultimately the market will solve this. The market will solve this. In the long run, the market will solve this. And he finally said, in the long run, we're all dead. And that's kind of the situation we find ourselves in right now. So I hate it from a long-term perspective. I think it's necessary from a short-term perspective. But I'll also say, in addition to what the Congress is doing, on a much grander scale, the Fed is doing some things to keep the economy together that are very important. They put trillions of dollars in a lot of places where it matters, keeping liquidity in the system, in the commercial sector, in the banking sector, in the mortgage sector. So there's a whole lot going on behind the scenes at the Fed, where I think they're doing a pretty good job. Again, there's a price to pay for that down the road. We're making money awfully cheap, but I think there's no choice right now.
You mentioned the Fed. I know they're just starting a 2-day meeting this week, if I recall the news. If you put your chairman of the Fed hat on, what would you be saying 2 days from now when they finish up their meeting?
Well, I think I would do the same thing that Chairman Powell has already done, and that is tell Congress you need to get something done here, because we do need that. But I mean, obviously, I wouldn't change any of the policies right now in terms of the things they're doing. They're buying up mortgage-backed securities to keep the mortgage market robust, and it's doing reasonably well right now. They're buying up commercial paper. They're even buying up PPP loans so the banks don't exhaust all their capital making those government guaranteed loans and still have money to lend for other purposes. They're doing things like that. I have met with the state banking commissioner virtually, of course, and some of the senior folks at the Fed during the course of this. And one of the things I've talked about is one of the ways we really got in trouble back in the 80s was with the oil situation was when the oil price just went down $1. I mean, it really wasn't that big a deal. All of a sudden, the first quarterly report that came up when those companies didn't meet their quarterly numbers, the banks wanted to bring in cash, and they got taken down by some probably overreaching regulation at the time. And I've told the examiners to the extent they can, if you have a good long-standing customer, let the bank work with them. I mean, not anything irresponsible, not anything to create a bubble or anything. But let banks work with their good customers that have shown a track record of decades of good performance, because they've got a couple of quarters here they can't help. Don't force them to do things. And I think the Fed has done a pretty good job of balancing that with its other responsibilities. And as you know, I've written books. I've been a pretty big critic of the Fed from time to time, but I give them very high marks on what they're doing right now.
Good, thank you. You're an economist. I'm a finance guy. That's what I got my PhD in. Give me your perspective on the behavior of the stock market at this point in time. It's kind of hard for me to understand that.
Well, it's very hard to understand, and start out saying I'm not a financial advisor, and I don't get involved in that much. I do work with the Dow. I help them rebalance their weights occasionally, that sort of thing. So I do spend a little time up there at the exchange, but. Yeah, the color I can give you is in a couple of different ways. One of the things Terry taught me, he may not remember that he taught me, but one of the things Terry taught me, or at least I absorbed out of the class, was the difference between uncertainty and risk. Basically, risk, what I'm talking about is, there's a spectrum out there. You can take more risk, you can take less risk. You have more expected return if you take more risk. And that's why some people want to invest in treasury bonds, and some people want to invest in oil and gas leases, and some in real estate, and some in the lottery. I mean, there's all this the risk return trade-off that's out there all the time, and that's what makes markets is the fact there's trillions of dollars, and different people want to be different places, and that lets us make deals. Uncertainty is when you can't see that curve. And back in March, when you would see the market fluctuate 1,000, 2,000 points a day over and over again, up at sometimes 1,000 points in each direction the same day, what we were seeing was the reaction to that uncertainty, the fact that this was such a different thing. We'd never seen it before. You had no idea what the risk-return trade-off was. When that happens, a couple of things happen. We shoot ourselves into cash. And obviously, we see 10-year treasuries at very, very low rates right now as people move into cash. The other thing is we just don't do anything because we're nervous and we want to wait till things are better. And so I think those kind of fluctuations, as you went through March, April, May, and so forth, we began to get more information, and you begin to see still fluctuations, but more on the 500 point a day range. 600, 700 points was a big day. Then we had a little bit of uncertainty. And you had a couple of those 1,000-point days, and now we're back into the more modest range. And basically, what I think we're seeing is we're revealing the curtain. We're giving you more and more of letting you see more and more of the distribution of risk and return all the time. And so consequently, people can make those decisions. Now, in the midst of that, there was obviously a big drop at first with all the uncertainty and people backing out. We've seen a nice rally in the market since that time. And, it ebbs and flows with the news about the virus on any given day, obviously. but we've seen a pretty good return. And what that seems to be telling us is you know, if you buy the thing that Terry taught me, that ultimately at the end of the day, the price of the stock should be the discounted present value of the long-term earnings appropriately discounted for risk, and plus any random thing going on that day, obviously. But if you put that aside, if you look at it that way, what that tells us is, on the whole, the investment community sees us coming out of this in a pretty good place. And I think that's a reasonably accurate assessment of things right now. So again, as far as the day-to-day fluctuations, Dr. Fauci could say something today, the market moved 300 points. You know, I mean, those we're in that kind of mode right now. We can't get out of that. And the market, historically, what the literature has shown, what research has shown is, it is a very efficient mechanism because there is so much buying and selling. It does process information very well, but it overreacts to immediate uncertain situations because it's not allowed to do what it does. And so that's about the most I can give you. I wish I could tell you where the Dow's going to be or where the S&P is going to be in a few months.
No forecasting.
I report the futures and do well, but unfortunately I can't do that.
Not a problem. Well, I tell you, let's turn to a couple of other topics. One, we're living in Texas and the Texas economy. I know you just put out I think your newsletter, you just put out a sort of a economic outlook for the U.S. economy and this kind of thing just in the last day or two. But Texas, I want to kind of turn to that. In terms of what does the Texas economy look like in the next, this year up to maybe the next 2, 3, 4 years in terms of political climate, as well as what election results how election results may impact Texas? Sure.
As far as Texas, for those of you that are on our email list, we did a blast this morning on the U.S. economy, our latest update. If you're on that mailing list, great. If you're not, you can go to our website and pick it up. It's out there. It's free. It's free. We're not charging for it. You can go sign up for it if you want to. And we'll be putting out one tomorrow on Texas and the major MSAs as well. So let me share a little bit of that one. And basically what we're seeing is, and it's kind of an unusual situation in Texas, we are falling a little bit more on the whole than the national economy. And that's primarily because of the fact that oil and gas is a very high value-added industry, and it's been through some pretty rough times here lately and kind of disproportionately affected Texas. We're looking year over year, not from average 2020 to average 2019. So you have to keep that in perspective. You know, the average 2019, obviously at the end of the year, we're doing better, did okay in January and February, then it starts falling like a rock. We're showing an average job loss this year in Texas of about 720,000 jobs. And that's on a base of about 13 million or so. So that's about a 6+ percent drop in employment. Pretty significant drop in employment, a little higher than what we're seeing in the nation. We're projecting a loss of about $90 billion in gross product. That's on a base of about 1.7 billion, so a little over 5% drop in output. So these are very significant numbers. Now, if you went back to April, we were down 1.34 million jobs. So when I say 700,000, we got some catching up to do to get there. And we have had a couple of solid months of job growth. We remains to be seen if we've had to kind of slow down the recovery and that sort of thing. You know, how that's all going to play out and what we have to do over the next few months if we have to do more of that. But that's what we're seeing right now. And we you know, there's so much uncertainty right now. I've never been in a situation where we had this many unknowns when we do this stuff. So it's a good thing it's free, because that way I can say it's worth what it's costing you. But basically, what we try to do is as Terry mentioned, we've had these models for years. We keep making them bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. And we have about 600 detailed industries we track to see how they're all performing and get the best information we can. Now, again, we're in a very uncertain time, but the bottom line is it's a big hit, but a nice comeback next year. A nice comeback. We think we'll probably get back in employment, both U.S. and Texas, to where we were in 2019 by about the early to middle part of 2022. So roughly about a 2-year, 26-month time period. It took 58 months for the U.S. to get back last time. So it's a faster recovery because there's not all the structural issues to deal with, but a much harder initial fall.
Good. Let me ask you, I was driving through West Texas a couple of weeks ago on my way to Colorado for a fly fishing trip with my son. And driving through, I wish I'd taken a picture of it, but in the foreground was a pump jack, and in the background was a wind farm, And over here on my right was some solar
Uh-huh.
panels. What's
Yeah.
going on with Texas and the energy industry?
Well, there's a lot going on, obviously, right now. I'll try not to make this too long of an answer, but there's a lot going on, and just a little bit of historical perspective here, if I can. We pretty much hit a peak in oil production in Texas of 2.2 million barrels a day in 1973. Okay. Now, for those of you who were around long enough to remember it, that was the year the energy crisis started, the Arab oil embargo. For the next 8 years, prices went up 1,200%. You would think that would generate a whole lot of more energy production, but it didn't. Energy production fell every year. And the reason was we were drilling like crazy. We still call that the oil boom here in Texas. We were drilling like crazy, but geology was taking so much away as the fields were aging and had been drilled out since the 30s that we couldn't keep up. And literally oil production fell every year from 73 to 2008. By 2008, it was down to 700,000 barrels a day from 2.2 million. So you were literally looking at, I mean, we were running out of oil. Everybody, I used to give speeches, people would talk about peak oil, hit the peak, now we're running out. Things changed in 2008 when fracking really began to catch on and horizontal drilling and all those things. Today, they are producing over 4 million barrels, twice the former peak. They thought they had about 20 years of reserves left at the very low production levels then. At the very high production levels now, there's 2 or 3 centuries left. So the whole thing has done a complete 180 in that sense. And a lot of things are driving that. Obviously, some technology, the technology in the oil industry itself, the ability to compress and ship natural gas, which essentially turns that into a global market as opposed to just a domestic market constrained by some pipelines. The elimination of the embargo on exporting oil, many things drive that. The global economy, the fact that all these emerging countries are starting to manufacture is driving significant demand in the industry. So the industry has I think, a very bright future. It is going to have to deal with climate change issues. But if you look at world demand and supply and what's going on with all the other types of energy, the bottom line is there's going to be so much demand for energy that 25, 30 years from today, we're still going to have to get 60 to 70% of our energy from hydrocarbons. So what we have to do is figure out ways to burn those things cleaner. And the industry is investing in that now. But I think that's a big challenge they face. It's going to do very, very well long term. It got kicked in the teeth by this downturn. And literally, and it's almost impossible to get your arms around this. If you think about all the things we use energy for, okay, the demand for energy fell 25% in 30 days in the world. I mean, that can only happen if you shut it down. I mean, that's the only way it can happen. And so obviously that kicked things in the teeth. At the same time that was going on, Saudi Arabia and Russia were rattling sabers saying they were going to increase production. So you're going to have this huge glut already, and they're going to increase production. Of course they didn't. They got a deal together and cut production some. We've cut it some by not bringing new frac wells on, as is Canada. And so bottom line is the demand went down about 26, 27 million barrels a day. Production went down about 12 or 13 million barrels a day. So you still had this big glut every day, and they had no place to put it. There was one day the contract price actually went negative because there was no place to put it, and it was the day the contracts came due. Whoever owned it at the end of the day had to take possession of it. And so there was actually this day where they were paying people to take it off their hands. But we worked through that. Price is now about 40 or so. Technology has improved dramatically for the way we produce oil in Texas and fracking. 5 years ago today, it took $75 a barrel to make sense to frack. Today, that number is about 45. In some parts of the southern Delaware Basin, out in West Texas, it's maybe 36. So, we're getting very close to those numbers again where it starts making sense to pick up a little bit. In fact, the fracking is up 20% this month over last month in the Permian Basin. And you have to be very careful these days with these percentages. It's up 20% over last month. That sounds great. It's down 2/3 from last year. So you have to be very careful when you listen to these percentages because we got the base so low that a lot of these increases don't mean that much. But in any case, so I think the oil and gas industry has a bright future. It has to work through this situation. We just saw Chevron buy Noble. We're going to see some more consolidation, I think, in this situation because the smaller companies are starved for capital right now. So and there's some good production that can be picked up at attractive prices. That's the oil piece. The natural gas piece, there's been so much production for so long that the price has been very low for a long time. And in fact, in West Texas, they've been flaring a lot of it because they literally don't have a place to put it in the pipeline, and it's not worth trying to do anything else with it. And I think you will see that change over time because as we deal with climate change, one of the fuels of the future, particularly for the incremental fuel for power generation, a lot of it's going to be in a lot of the world natural gas, and so I think that's going to drive that market forward. We did a study, hadn't been released yet because we're waiting until we get past the pandemic and people pay attention. But just what the demand for electric cars will do. If you look at the percentage around the world, how many electric cars we're supposed to have in the next 25 years or so, what percentage of that electricity is likely to be generated by natural gas, the heat factor between natural gas and oil, you find a huge surge in natural gas demand just from that one thing. And so there's a lot of that going on. Now, you mentioned the windmills, and I drove when I was driving to Marshall, I saw the same thing, rigs and windmills in the same shot. And you see it all the time. There's huge wind farms in West Texas. Texas is the largest wind producer in the country. And again, I think solar we're just getting started on, but obviously we have a lot of sunshine and a lot of arid land, so we have the opportunity to do a lot with solar as well. And I think those have a good future. Not to get into too much weird economics, but presumably if you're on this call, you had at least a class or two sometime. As you know, pricing is based on marginal cost. The marginal cost of the last unit, because electricity is a competitive market here in Texas and many other places now in the country. So pricing is based on the marginal cost of the last unit. But wind power has zero marginal cost. I mean, once you got the thing up, the wind's turning, it's just generating power. And so you have very close to zero marginal cost. So when you have a spring day, when it's 70 degrees and nobody's running air conditioning, nobody's running heat, and that sort of thing, there are times when the entire market in Texas now is supplied by natural gas. We built the transmission lines. I'm sorry, by wind. We built the transmission lines to get across there. In those days, the marginal cost is zero, and our power bills can go down and that sort of thing. In the heat of the summer, though, whatever their power goes on the market first because it has the lowest marginal cost. So whatever power is selling for, they get all that basically as profit. So there is a business model for profit in that industry. The other thing that's happening, of course, is battery storage is changing dramatically. And the reason that's so important is if you live in West Texas, the wind blows, as I do, the wind blows in the spring and the fall at night. We need our most power in the winter and the summer in the daytime. So there's a mismatch of when you can get the most wind and when you need the most power. And so basically, if we can store that wind energy better, then it becomes even a more viable part of the market. And of course, it also plays into the climate issue well. So I think all of these things have a good future. And everybody, a lot of people will think, well, oil displaced wind, that sort of thing. I can assure you, we have run these numbers. If you develop wind to its fullest potential, solar to its fullest potential, even throw in nuclear to its fullest potential, and let's throw in a black swan. Let's throw in something we don't know about yet that's going to change the world. You do all of that, and we're still going to be getting a huge portion of the world's energy needs from hydrocarbons 30 years from now. So there's room for everybody in this market.
Good. Thanks. Well, speaking of industry, obviously you were talking about the energy industry in Texas and the world, but I had a question come in that I'll pop an unexpected question on you, Ray.
Sure,
industry related, but I found this interesting. Your thoughts on the convention and trade show industry coming back, and how it was first to shut down, probably one of the last to come back, but contributes, there's the word again, $1 trillion to the U.S. economy annually. Thoughts on that particular industry and the outlook?
Well, it is a very big industry, and it means a lot to the country. It means a lot to Texas. We have a lot of major convention locations here in Texas, and tourism travel in general is a very big industry. Obviously, it will come back in a different form than it was before. We'll have to do things differently. Behaviors will change. I think it will come back because there are huge advantages to face-to-face meetings with people. There are huge advantages to trade shows, face-to-face, looking and touching stuff. I mean, new products, that sort of thing. So I think it will come back. I think it will come back in a different, obviously the format will be a little bit different. And we don't know how long it will be until we have vaccines, treatments, herd immunity, some combination thereof. You know, I mean, there will come a time, I think about 9/11. You know, after 9/11, I'm a person that flies all the time. And I really, after 9/11, you know, for a month or so, man, my planes were empty. It was great. I was on a plane every day, and it was pretty much empty. And over time, we got kind of back to normal, but not exactly back to normal. Back before that, we could all go to the gate and meet anybody we wanted to. We could take anything on the plane we wanted to. We could, you know, no problem. You didn't think about taking your shoes off to go through security. I mean, all that. So things changed, but essentially we got back to a pretty decent normal. And that will happen with this over time because there are so many advantages to face-to-face. One thing I do think, and this is kind of a crystal ball kind of thing, but we're already seeing it start to happen. A significant thing on convention centers, this has to do with the economic growth of Texas, and we released some stuff recently about this that some of you may have seen. If you want to see it, it's on our website free. There's a bunch of stuff out there. But anyway, is one of the things that's becoming more and more critical on convention bookings is having non-discrimination policies in your state. That is, if you don't discriminate against particular groups for whatever reason. And Texas has fallen a little bit behind on that. And that is something now that a lot of convention business just simply won't come because corporate sponsors don't like it, that sort of thing. It's becoming very important to be competitive that we move somewhat in that direction. We have a bipartisan bill in the legislature this year, co-sponsored by Republicans and Democrats, to try to start working on that some here in Texas. But one thing that's going to happen is competition is going to intensify because everybody's been kicked in the teeth and everybody's going to try to come back. So when it's time for conventions or anything else, the competition among states is going to become much more intense. And that's a disadvantage we have right now that we really don't need in that. But no, they'll come back, but it's going to be in a different format, a different form, and probably evolve over time. And that's what I think you'll see with a lot of things with this. But I think it's an important enough industry with enough people having a stake in it that you will see it come back.
You know, another industry that's being tremendously impacted is the education market.
Right.
You hear about K through 12 and all the difficulty of decisions being made, as well as secondary education institutions. Any thoughts on that as an industry?
Sure. Well, those of you who, I don't know, I had a syndicated column that's out in a whole bunch of places. Those of you who read the last 2 weeks, one of them was public ed, one of them was higher ed. So it's an issue that's on a lot of people's minds, and it's difficult to solve. I mean, there's no magic answer. There's probably no one thing that works for everybody, but it's absolutely critical that we solve it. I don't know if any of you read the Dallas Morning News or not. Go Google the Ides of Texas. That's a 1,000-word piece I wrote in there 2 or 3 weeks ago about the importance of higher and public education to the future of Texas. And it's absolutely critical. And what we found during this pandemic is almost 12% of the kids totally lost contact with education during this period. And that is, we cannot afford that. And, you know, 86% of them were disadvantaged. Huge percentage of those, much higher than a percentage of the population, were Black and Hispanic. We can't afford for those gaps to continue to widen. And it's very important. Now, it has to be done safely, and some combination, I'm sure, remote learning and distance learning and face-to-face and trying to use our facilities more efficiently. I know different schools are trying different things. I mean, Garland started kind of some year-round stuff, and you start to think about that. You're trying to space people out. Buildings are now empty 3 months of the year. So that, you know, you may see more of that as a more efficient way to use buildings, that sort of thing. And again, it'll change as the situation with the virus changes as well. But it's critically important that we do that. Higher ed similarly facing all kinds of challenges. You know, people going to a lot of campuses have already gone to a purely virtual environment. As soon as that happens, people want a tuition cut, you know, and they're already strapped for funds because of higher expenses to doing this, investments that have to be made. Same time, revenues are coming under pressure. State and local governments are in a bad way right now. I hope the next stimulus package helps them some, because we've had a basic situation, again, through no fault of their own. And then there's plenty of times I've faulted state and local governments over the years, but through no fault of their own, their expenses have gone up. You can't help that. Their expenses have gone up significantly, and yet their revenues have gone down significantly at the same time. And again, we have to bridge those gaps to keep that structure together. We can't afford to let any of our public infrastructure deteriorate. And above all of that is our education system. So it's going to change a lot. It's going to morph and change and evolve over time. The good thing is with higher ed, that's where a huge source of America's innovation and creativity comes from. And they have a great incentive to solve some of these problems right now. So I think you'll see a lot of innovative solutions come out right there. I saw Rice, my PhD school, built some circus tents, kind of things so they got more outdoor classes but protecting the elements. I mean, who knows? That sounds kind of low tech, but who knows? There'll be all sorts of solutions that come out.
Good, thanks. Here's one that kind of gets in the weeds a little bit, but I think has an interesting economist perspective that you might add to it. The question is, did the $600 extended unemployment benefit help on balance? Should it be extended? Of course, that's being debated right now. Extended at a lower amount, or is it hindering people going back to work? Well, from an economist standpoint, what would your counsel be?
Well, there's no question. I mean, obviously, some people got the $600 and chose to stay home. I mean, that's a fact. That did happen. It's a fairly small percentage of the people. If you think about it, if you have any kind of time dimension to your decision-making process, that's a very short-sighted decision, because that thing's going to run out fairly soon, and the job you could have had is already going to be filled. And so it was not a very particularly prudent decision to make. I do think some form of aid to folks, whether it's that form or another form, is important right now, because again, if you have a person who is basically kind of struggling by and working and that sort of thing, and all of a sudden they have no income or much reduced income for 6 months, it's going to be very hard to survive. And the foreclosure, they may extend that, but foreclosure moratoriums are about to run out. The courts are already full of dockets, are already filling up for people doing that sort of thing. So you can have a lot of social disruptions that can serve to delay things. So I'm not sure that was ever the direct cash payment was ever the best way to go about doing that. There could have been some other ways to handle that, but some form of ongoing support for folks who are suffering in this time is I think something that is important and should be a part of the package right now.
You mentioned mortgages and that kind of thing. I haven't touched on this yet, but stability of our financial institutions as this thing continues going forward. Any perspective concerns?
I think our financial institutions on the whole will be fine, and a couple of reasons for that. One, primarily because the Fed's going to make sure they're fine. Yeah. And they have the tools to do it. And they have the willingness to do it, and they've shown that. And they've spent a huge amount of money keeping the system liquid in whatever way they needed to in the past few months, and I think you'll continue to see that happen. There's also discussion. I know that one version of the current bill that I've been talking to folks about, I think is good, is changing the things that have to count in your capital allocation formulas for how much capital you have to keep on hand and that sort of thing, just to try to do some things to bridge through this situation, some temporary things. But the Fed is focused on that, and Chairman Powell has basically said we will keep the system solvent. So there'll be a few banks probably that are maybe over leveraged in energy or something like that may have some difficulties, but on the whole, I think the financial system will come out of this just fine.
Any concerns from a state budget standpoint? Any details on state and local governments' lack of revenue, or revenues being impacted, sales tax down, that kind of thing, yet increases in expenses?
Sure. I mean, that's one of the things that really has to be addressed. The comptroller came out last week and projected, a $5.6 trillion shortfall this next time around, and emphasized how much uncertainty is associated with that, because there is a lot of uncertainty associated with that. Texas has not met its needs for a long time. We have a lot of deferred maintenance in state government. You can argue about social programs and that sort of thing all you want to, but let's put all that aside. When we had to suddenly process 300,000 unemployment claims a week, when we had historically been processing 7,000 or 8,000, their technology includes fax machines. Okay, that we simply haven't kept up with the infrastructure of government the way we should have, and it's really kicked us in the teeth in several arenas right here, where we just were called upon to do some things, but we just simply didn't have the capability and the resources to do. And obviously, public ed depends on state government for a lot of its funding, and the legislature in the last session put some more state money into it, and we were hoping sets a pattern for the future. So it's going to be very challenging here in Texas and everywhere in the country. Ours is a little more severe because a lot of our business-to-business sales tax and, of course, our severance tax is tied to the oil and gas industry, which took a pretty hard short-term hit here, and that's really playing havoc with it. We have a nice balance of several $1 billion in our rainy day fund or economic stabilization fund, I'm not sure what could be a bigger storm than this, so hopefully they'll consider this a rainy day and perhaps use some of that revenue to backstop some things. But it's critical. As I said a moment ago, there's nothing more important to the future of Texas than public education and getting it right. The way our demographics are shifting right now is it's absolutely essential. Just one quick example, again, from this, I put in this California news thing. But today in Texas, Hispanics represent 52% of the kids in public school in Texas today. The families they come from have 5%, actually 4.8% of the household wealth in Texas. So you got half the kids, 5% of the money. That's not a sustainable situation for a long-term future without some significant intervention and really providing high-quality education and opportunities. So there's a lot of things at stake here. I hope they don't come in and just try to plug holes and stop gap and cut this and cut that. Usually higher ed takes a big beating when they do that, public higher ed. And you don't want to see any of those things happen. But they're going to face a very, very difficult challenge this time around in terms of how to deal with this. And every state government in the country is, and hopefully, again, this next stimulus package will address that. The Democratic version does, the Republican does to some extent. You don't know how the negotiation back and forth will be.
Good, thanks. And that kind of deals with this next question a little bit in terms of just the deficit that's being created and funding these social needs that you're talking about. Question here is, how do you feel about a consumption tax at the federal level to be used for paying down the debt? Maybe a 1% consumption tax that invoked to pay down the rising debt. From an economist, your perspective on that?
It's not a very efficient tax. It's really not, and it's somewhat regressive. And you have to be very, very careful here when you talk about this. Anytime we talk about paying down the debt, that is a myth. The only way you pay down the debt is you first have to run a surplus, because otherwise you're just making this year's deficit less and increasing the debt at a slower rate. And that's what we've been doing, and frankly, what we're going to do for a long time. And we don't have to balance the budget. I mean, we've got the world's most stable financial system. Everybody fluctuates to dollars in times of uncertainty. I'd say our Treasury bill rates got down to 10-year money. You could buy it for 0.2%. I mean, it really people want U.S. debt in times of need. So it's not that, but this notion of just never addressing anything, never trying to offset the spending with revenues is very difficult. It's certainly a consumption tax is one thing you can put on the table. I think you'd find a lot of difficulty with that in that, number one, it is the primary source of revenue for a lot of state governments. And here in Texas is a primary example, both state and local governments. I get a lot of their money from consumption tax here in Texas. And so I think you'd find that to be a fairly difficult thing to do with a lot of pushback in trying to do it. And again, as taxes go, it's not the most efficient tax by a long shot.
We're winding down, got time for a couple more questions. And this one kind of gets back to Texas and industries. What industries in Texas will be best to survive and grow in the near term and long term? Will biotech, biomed ever overtake as the top marketplace?
Well, biotech and biomed are growing very rapidly in Texas. We were nowhere on the radar screen 20 years ago. Today, we're rising very quickly. In fact, about 40% of growth in biotech the past 5 years has been in Texas. And we've made a lot of investments to make that happen. We have the National Lab in Galveston. The CPRIT, the Cancer Prevention Research Institute, Texas has put billions of dollars into that. That's helped drive our biotech situation. So the biotech has been growing a lot in Texas. I don't think it will overtake the petroleum industry anytime soon, but it's growing a lot. And also some of the evolution in technology there is helping biotech. Big pharma is the one place Texas never had a location. We didn't have any big pharmaceutical companies. That's our big glaring hole. Well, as genomics has evolved and we're getting into these individualized medicines and that sort of thing, new facilities are having to be certified. And that gives Texas an opportunity to compete in a way we haven't before. And so I think that's one. I think most of the tech industries will do pretty well long term. As far as other industries, you mentioned winners and losers. Obviously, the online retailing is doing quite well right now. Delivery services are doing quite well right now. Some of those things. I think again, long term, the energy industry has a good future. As we talked about it at some length, we have to get through this current situation. Yeah. A lot of industries are suffering, and obviously the way we do a lot of things is going to change. A lot of personal services, salons, That sort of thing. They have to change their mode of operation and figure out new models. Retail on the business side. I mean, we'd already moved more to these walking outdoor facility malls instead of the old traditional mall because people like that better. They're going to figure out new and more creative ways to draw people back in to that type of shopping. Restaurants will have to kind of change their business models up, some at least for a while. And so there's a lot of industries that are going to evolve and change some. And, short term, there have been very few winners. I mean, about the only winners you can come up with are like online retail and delivery service and folks that support that sort of thing. But longer term, the one thing, and I remember, Terry, you and I were in a session together in President Bush's summit back 20 years ago there at the Baylor campus. And one of the things we talked about that day was, the question I was asked was, what makes us different? And the answer is, we always do the next big thing. We create, we innovate. And here in Texas, we have a long history of that. I mean, the transistor, which is the foundation of semiconductors, was invented in Texas. Nanotechnology was invented in Texas. I mean, we have a long history of innovation. All the major heart surgery advances were in Texas. So we have a long history of being innovative, and we'll innovate and we'll create things that push us forward here as well.
As we wind down, Ray, and this kind of touches on what you were just talking about, but let's broaden it out a little bit. As you look into your crystal ball, in our parlance, it'd be known as an econometric model. What major broad patterns do you see that might change going forward?
Well, obviously there's going to be a lot of behavioral changes, and these are more crystal ball than econometric model. I'll get to that one in a minute, but there's obviously going to be some behavior changes. A lot of industry are going to adapt to that. I think some of the things we're going to see, I mentioned tourism a moment ago, but economic development, the competition is going to become extremely intense because everybody wants every location. You saw the hoopla over Tesla here recently, that we got here in Texas. But now that every state has taken it on the chin, and every country for that matter, everybody's going to want every big location. So that's going to intensify a lot. And I think companies are going to look at the world differently. They're going, instead of just looking at the things they've been looking at historically, the cost and maybe some incentives and that sort of thing, they're also going to look at what does your healthcare system look like? What does your education system look like? The discrimination issue we mentioned earlier. Prior to this, as you know, there's been a big movement, the so-called ESG movement, environmental and social governance. The Business Roundtable last year basically said, we're not going to focus so much on the short-term quarterly profits anymore, but the long-term sustainability of our companies and our constituencies and that sort of thing, which is profit maximization just with a longer time frame involved. And that's going to go on steroids. I mean, people are just paying more attention to those things. That's going to create some fundamental changes for us. I think the emphasis on workforce is going to be accelerated a great deal because again, talent is going to be a key to driving everything forward. And so I think those are the things that I would kind of, just as I kind of step back and look at things to change. When I do look at economic models and see what that can tell me very quickly, a couple of things. The interesting thing that tells me is what hasn't changed. What hasn't changed is the underlying demographic patterns of the country and the world. And that drives a lot of our behavior. What hasn't changed is the cost structures of various types of production. Well, that hasn't changed materially. So a lot of what we saw before will come back. It will come back differently. And I think we have to keep that in mind because it tells us we have a lot to work with here, a lot going forward. A lot of things that were already in motion can be back in motion. And we have to view this as kind of a pause, a huge one, and one that has some implications, but also something that ultimately we're going to be back on a path that we were doing fairly well on before. And if we make the right adjustments, we can do fairly well on it again.
Right. Well, Ray, I think we've got a few wrap-up kind of things to take care of, but I really appreciate you. I really consider you a friend, and I appreciate you. You're one who is always willing to come at our call, and so thank you for being a Baylor alum
if I can take 10 seconds, and
yeah.
I promise I'll keep it. I couldn't say any more than that anyway. But we have been friends for a long time. We kid each other some. Terry has done a phenomenal job as the dean of this business school. It's been through unprecedented growth and change during his tenure. And I hope I get a chance to say this to a bigger group, actually in person at some point. But to the large group that's watching that, I just think we all need to congratulate Terry on a really fantastic career at the business school. I'm glad to see it continue a while longer.